Thank you so much, Samu, for that beautiful introduction, and thanks to Mr. Machila as well, to the team that organized the series. Thank you so much. I have noted with so much happiness when you mentioned the fact that College of Graduate Studies leadership took my presentation last year to heart and deemed it fit to start indigenization of postgraduate scholarship series, the first of its kind. And to be honored as well to start the series with the presentation today. I feel very much honored by that. Indeed, we shouldn't just have presentations. We should see what we can take from them, how they can benefit the scholarship, especially at the level of postgraduate studies or project. So you tasked me to present on two important dimensions of a paradigm, which are ontology and epistemology. And the very important word there is all about relevance, and I take its relevance in as far as indigenous knowledge systems are concerned and the communities at large. Right, I've prepared 17 slides, and I will go through my presentation now. So this presentation in brief covers putting paradigms in methodological context. Secondly, a paradigm as an entry into research methodology, then followed by types of paradigms. Then I will then zoom into the core of the presentation today, which is ontology and epistemology. I thought to approach the presentation this way for the mere fact, like I said, that ontology and epistemology are the tenets of a paradigm. And so I wouldn't actually just jump into them without coming through the paradigm per se. Then a bit of introduction, researching from a decolonial perspective. We know that a lot is happening in our country. We have recently and up to now are being revisited by the very hashtag fees must fall, which we saw around 2015, 2016, when the emphasis is on fees. There's an underlying message that the students have been actually bringing through, which is decolonization of education and the curriculum. And we cannot run away from that. If you go and revisit the CAPS document by the Department of Basic Education, you will also realize that it is undergirded by the 7 core principles which are hooked on the national constitution, which are about transformation. And a few of them are indigenous knowledge systems, social justice, and human rights, to name a few. And so if this transformation is at play at the school level, how much more at the university level. And we know that universities are called to transform in as far as epistemologies that we teach students. And for me, this is very, very important for a researcher at postgraduate studies, and also as academics seasoned or developing to research with relevance in mind. A big question that comes to every one of us is what are we researching on, and what is the impact of our research, and how relevant is it to the communities that we engage or in our research, or whom we research about. So we've got to understand, first of all, research as a tool of research camps, communities, or even cultures, which is underpinned by philosophical perspectives. And for me, this is like political parties, and it's all about power relations. If you didn't know, audience, that the writing is actually about, tussling for power, you better know today, or from today. That's why your work must be seen by other scholars who will comment on it, and you will realize that we actually are in a tug of war in as far as power relations is concerned. To actually name, to tell you what I experienced previously when I started to delve into the IKS field. I had a conversation with one of the renowned professors in the country, whom I had a tea discussion, discussion over tea with. And as he asked me, what am I specializing in? I told him that I'm beginning to specialize in IKS. That's more than 15 years ago. And he responded by saying, but what animal is that? So the moment a person reacts like that or responds like that, you should know that that is an issue of power relations. They are trying to question as to what are you bringing into the research field? What is it that what is that you are mentioning? Is it gonna fly as a kite or not? So I have met with a lot of opposition this far, but I have stood the test of time, and it has brought, I'm thankful to those oppositions because they have made me what I am today, to stand as a strong scholar in the field. So research affects, shapes, or transforms, or to the other opposite, may even oppress society. If you look at how knowledge has been constructed and universalized from the Western world, I relate that pretty much to how governments are actually governing people. Oppressive forces that actually deny people growth. And therefore, you've got to approach your research with that mentality in the back of your mind as to, is your research also transforming societies or perpetrating oppression per se? So it's very, very important to have that question hang in your mind as you conduct your research. And this will direct you to think critically even about what you have chosen to research about. And therefore, for me, You cannot be an indigenous or decolonial researcher if you are not going to keep a critical stance in your research project. So we are talking today about paradigmic issues that actually frame research from a philosophical or worldview point of departure. Indigenous people tell their colonial stories. Linda Smith, who's the voice of the Maoris in New Zealand, is very, very strong on this point to say, as indigenous people, our story is a decolonial story because it's very real that we have gone through from generation to generation through episodes of oppression. And we cannot play it down that we don't know what happened, what we have gone through. And this does not mean that we are keeping grudges. We are trying to be tenacious about going forward to dismantle the colonial walls, and research is very, very instrumental in achieving that mission. And but for me, it's not complete if research projects or products in the form of dissertation and thesis and articles and books and conference proceedings are going to beautify the shelves of libraries and they are not used, then it's a mission not accomplished. They need to be used. That's why I so much acknowledge the fact that my 2020 presentation in the college was taken forward to start a series of this nature. We've got to implement the knowledge that we exchange, the knowledge that gets exposed to us, and not let it lie. Supervisors should therefore free themselves from the colonial clause of research, so they should also free their students. It's very, very important to approach postgraduate projects from a very critical point of view, from a transformative point of view. We must be interested as supervisors as to what is the transformation element or elements that will be articulated in our students' projects. Because if we don't do that, we might be suspects of coloniality, perpetrating the traditional scientific approach to research. So we need to first declaw or unclaw ourselves from that by thinking about what we are doing ourselves, and so that we can be able to channel our students' work appropriately. It's not all about students, having ambition for career pathing or for promotion at their respective work, but it's also about life-changing kind of project that we are engaging them in. And this is very critical for me. So one should be self-aware as a researcher. And that's a question of your paradigmic stance. What is your identity? How do you approach reality, and what do you make of that reality? The world lies around you. The world lies there, but we can only know the world because we perceive of it, and that is informed by the belief system, by the value system, by the cultural system that actually make meaning of what you see, what you taste, what you hear, and what you touch. That's very, very important. That's about the worldview, knowledge, and knowledge construction. So we must strive for social justice. And for me, as an expert in the field of IKS, the best way to do it is to actually decolonize our thinking and keep on thinking about your identity as a researcher, as I said, and think about human rights. It's not only politicians out there that must actually think and lead us in as far as human rights. Intellectually, we have a mandate, we have a duty to actually perform as researchers. And this reminds me of an article that I published some time ago titled The Struggles of an African Scholar. We know that in the research field, we also struggle. Sometimes your research is being reviewed by those that already come into the review exercise with an attitude. And so they will want to shoot down your ideas. And as a supervisor, when you receive back examiners' reports, it's important that you also read them from a critical point of view as to, you know, are these people actually trying to shoot down your student's project, especially when the student has researched in the field of IK or is raising issues of transformation. So the question is, are you selling yourself away through research, or are you striving for ownership of your research? This talks more about or relates to, you know, you should actually not distantiate yourself from your own research. Last year, I kept on emphasizing what Data, whose work I quoted quite a lot as an MND student, how he experienced the whole game about research and went to question how research is being approached. So it talks to the issues of even writing from the first person perspective as a style of writing, to bring the research closer to you, to be part and parcel of you. Because if you keep on referring to yourself as the researcher, that seems to distantiate the research away from you. And I know it's not an easy thing to come by, because reviewers of articles, examiners of dissertation and thesis, some of them who are schooled in from a traditional school of thought will always question you writing from the first person perspective. And I have not succumbed to that myself. I have already fought against it. Much of my work I do write from the first person perspective. In that sense, you'll be owning your research. Therefore, the treatment of students, although this was quoted from a research that was done with the students in schools, but it sends a message to us in the postgraduate project. So if you see yourself in the eye of colonial teacher, colonially minded teacher, or you could replace that with a supervisor, colonially minded supervisor, you will realize you might be a culprit of what is quoted here. They, students, experience conceptual separation from their roots. They are compelled to examine their own experiences through the assumptions, paradigms, constructs, and language of other people. They lose their cultural identity, and they find it difficult to develop a sense of affiliation and connection to a school. They become universal strangers. disaffected and alienated, and all too many eventually drop out of school. If you contextualize this within the supervision project, there could be problems of this nature, where the supervisor is actually a supervisor from a point of controlling and wearing a cap like a master and telling the student instead of treating the student as a scholar and wanting to learn along with the student. So if you wear a colonial cap, this would apply where the student concerned will be learning your own research language. You will be forcing the student to see the world like you see it, and you are therefore not developing the student. We should develop future scholars who will be independent in their thinking and not be dependent. They should not feel like because you are not there in the conference room, they feel unprotected and that they don't have someone who will support them. They should grow and fly because they are people in their own rightful stand. They wear their own assumptions because they see the world differently from how you see it. They have their own constructs. They have been around people. They grew up amongst people that have shaped their identity and knowledge construction. They should not move away from that. And in fact, these are the people that must grow to be able to actually plow back to their communities. But we have seen this not happening. We see, as I said earlier on, parallelism between what is happening in institutions of learning and what is out there in institutions outside of the academic institutions. You see a perfect parallelism that the moment people graduate, they tend to look down on their very own and the context that they have come from, and to a point of actually despising that and wanting now to behave otherwise, to be seen as they have now developed, they are now civilized. For me, perfect and true civilization is that of actually thinking back to where you come from and being able not to divorce yourself from those that you are part and parcel of. Therefore, as a specialist in the IKS field and technology with further focus in that field, I've always questioned the frog jumping mentality that is found in science, especially as conceptualized from the Western world, that the local technologies in the so-called third world are being frog jumped or are being bulldozed or sidelined, for that matter, by the so-called modern science and technology, which is quite disappointing because this is actually only trying to say indigenous knowledge systems cannot apply in this world. And we are actually doing injustice if we follow a route like that. The big question for especially some of you that are researching in the field of science and technology, you've got to question and try to think about what are the technologies that are visible or exist in your context, indigenous context, and what space, to what extent are they given in the research environment and in the development of the world at large. So, really puts this quoted piece to say modern science and technology has dislocated third world societies, destroyed traditional cultures, and played havoc with the environment of third world nations. It has also replaced a way of knowing which is multidimensional and based on synthesis in third world societies with a linear, clinical, inhuman, and rationalist mode of thought. Western science and technology has systematically plundered third world countries in the name of scientific rationality. This reminds me of a paper that I presented in 2015 at an international conference in Nigeria, where I talked about the scramble of African resources, where I mapped out the looting of resources from Africa to an extent that Africa suffers from a dependency syndrome, where I actually presented a table about the richness of the African continent in as far as natural resources are concerned, iron, gold, platinum, and the like. But these are mined. Africans are made to be laborers to mine this, and they are shipped out of the continent. They come back in the form of byproducts. We get excited by a Mercedes-Benz latest model coated with chrome, and but it's a triple or 4 times as expensive to buy compared to the product, the natural product that was mined. So this is not good for our development. It's a disservice to the development of our society. And I could put an argument to say, as long as the third world or developing world is treated this way, we are far from being liberated in the knowledge economy and also in the production out there. So join me to continue to research and pose questions and to unravel the richness of knowledge, science, and technology that are of indigenous origin that must be promoted. African Union is actually promoting the question of sustainable development, especially in the Southern African community. And therefore, it's very, very important that we be part of that project. Currently, I'm conceptualizing a project that would involve a few universities that's going to research in that direction. Therefore, then we have Orefbu, an African scholar who views technology as a culture. You can't dissociate the two. Technology is an element of culture. Every culture has its own technology. It includes the arts and letters, modes of life, the fundamental rights of the human being, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. Culture is the totality of the technological, sociological, and ideological features of a given society. It is a man-made environment. The culture of a society determines the nature of technological development and the evolving technological culture. It may appear rather rude that during students' unrest, They even attempted to dismantle the physical establishments or structures on campus, the obvious targets being the colonial or statues of colonial figures. But if you psychologically analyze the effects of these establishments, that students learn in an environment like that, it's a question of how do they actually make association with those structures to learn in an environment like that, where they don't see anything that actually is portraying African epistemologies. I remember I was at New Zealand as a visiting scholar some time ago, and at the University of Waikato. And on campus, you would see the Maori symbols and some buildings built, designed from the Maori culture. In that sense, one would say the students are in a right environment, and there were also representations of other cultures. So in a multicultural kind of environment, everyone feels accommodated in that sense. It's not happening yet so much in our country. We need students, those that are in hardcore sciences, who will, for an example, grow as engineers, to engineer from an African indigenous perspective. That needs to be considered. But it starts with research that would inform that. Again, the question comes, what are we researching about? And what impact and relevance does it make out there in the communities? Then we've got to therefore think about paradigms in the methodological context, because they are an issue of methodology. When you enter your methodology for your research, you've got to position yourself. Even though I feel strongly that right from your chapter 1, you should already put your stance as a researcher. Say something about where you come from, say something about how you will approach your research, to give a window even before, into your research project, even before you come to your methodology chapter. So, having said that, traditionally, quantitative methodology is the root of research methodology, especially from the hardcore sciences like biology, chemistry, physics, geology, etc. So when I was talking about power relations or power struggles, you have Western professors who ever lived, who actually came up with ideas and realism to try and define the world from their own cultural lens, from their own value systems lens, at the expense of all other alternative cultures and belief systems. And quantitative research was therefore pushed to try and protect that territory, to maintain it and universalize it. But then around the 1980s, an opposition camp was established in the qualitative research methodology sphere, which started to question the assumptions and the beliefs and the values of the quantitative methodologists. At first, these two camps were purists who were working in defense of their own methodologies. Quantitative researchers trying to defend their territory, and quantitative trying to defend theirs as well. Then lately came upon the mixed methods and multi-methods, which, if you like, provided a middle point to try and appease the two camps. But then the main goal being that of mixed methods and multi-methods provide a deeper understanding of the phenomenon when you try to bring multiple methods together or mixed methods together. And this, therefore, brought another dimension, going to the fourth dimension, about the thriving of decolonial project or anti-colonial paradigms and methodologies. So research methods are informed by paradigms which are anchored on ontology, epistemology, axiology, and methodology. So, Chair, Mr. Machila, actually the story is not complete if we only limit it at ontology and epistemology. Axiology and methodology are the other two dimensions or tenets of paradigms that need to be considered for discussion as well. And that's important for me because students and the mistake that some supervisors commit to actually clue the students to traditional scientific methodologies, when there are multiple methodologies that the third world or indigenous environments can actually provide. So at some stage, this needs to be an aspect of discourse as well. Axiology speaks to the ethics and value systems, which is also quite important for one to understand it also from an indigenous perspective. But for the sake of the mandate for today, I have limited my presentation to ontology and epistemology. So the paradigms that came about are the positivist, which pushes quantitative methodologies, and interpretivist or constructivist, which pushes the qualitative methodologies. But then you have also critical and anti-colonial paradigms. And later on, I will also introduce to you one paradigm that I have actually suggested in my latest publication, which I call resistance paradigm. So these paradigms have a history of moving from a narrow or linear reality to multi-layered realities and transformation, with a philosophy or worldview playing a big role. So the narrow linear reality is that which is being pushed by the quantitative or methodologies or positivists, which tries to sandwich the world into one way of looking at the world, whereas the interpretivists are actually arguing it out to say there are multi-layered realities, and they are backed up by the constructivists who say knowledge is socially, who claim that knowledge is socially constructed and it's not neutral per se. Therefore, let's come to the next one then, paradigm and entry into research methodology. We should understand, according to Antwi and Hamza, all research is based on some underlying philosophical assumptions about what constitutes valid research and which research methods are appropriate for the development of knowledge in a given study. So a paradigm gives, like I said, your entry into the research methodology. But it is driven by philosophical assumptions. And a selection of research methodology depends on a paradigm, therefore. So a paradigm from a Greek understanding is paradigma, which means pattern, or which was first used by Kuhn in that year, 1962, for a conceptual framework shared by a community of scientists. So you can see that it all starts. That's why, as a researcher, depending on your specialization, you become a member of that part of community. That's why down to a community engagement project, you are called upon to be a member of your specialization community. And these are the communities that tend to protect their own territories. And I've put notably there, a paradigm refers to a research culture with a set of beliefs, values, and assumptions that a community of researchers has about the nature and conduct of research. So therefore, every researcher, and particularly to our MND students, especially PhD students, who are required to actually shake the nest of knowledge making, you should actually approach your project by actually checking on the beliefs, values, and assumptions. Try to understand whoever you read, whose product or literature you are reading, by also looking at the context they are from and what shapes their ideas or ideology vis-a-vis your own context. That's very, very important to consider. A paradigm is therefore a pattern, structure, and framework or approach to thinking about and doing research. Paradigm is based on 3 dimensions: ontology, epistemology, and methodology. Many researchers limit it to that, but I have put the axiology. We cannot leave this out. And I can understand those who leave that aspect out. I suspect they are purists, pure positivists, who claim that from a quantitative research point of view, you must free research from value systems. It should be objective as possible. Therefore, they don't want to cloud research with axiology. Then moving on to types of paradigms, as I've already mentioned some of them, there's positivist paradigm, which claims that the social world can be studied in the same way as the natural world, and it involves empirical hypothesis testing, and it's driven or directed by probabilistic model that is determined by previous research. And this is that last part of the statement there is what actually contributes hugely to perpetrate in communities that would protect this paradigm. And hear me well, good attendees, I'm not shooting down positivism as such. I vie for the middle ground. There are times where you need it. But as a critically minded researcher, we've got to bring transformation in how we actually use it or implement it, and the design that we come up with for our research project. And then constructivist-interpretivist paradigm claim that human behavior is multi-layered and cannot be determined by predefined probabilistic models. It is determined rather by environmental factors rather than genes. You will remember, some of you that might be of my age, that the time when we went to school, our intellectualism was being measured based on genes. The psychology researchers have been pushing this. I remember when I went to write what they call entrance test to university, I was made to sit for that kind of test that would determine my IQ, which is related to genes. And this has caused such accident by denying others from a social justice and human rights point of view. By doing that, we are trying to deny the fact that in every human being, God has placed a certain ability. Instead of actually studying what the person is gifted in or talented in, we try to come up with our own nasty judgment, lens of judgment, to try and trace genes and try to discredit people according to that. So interpretivists respect environmental factors. They actually shape people and the behavior, and therefore we've got to acknowledge multi-layered realities in that sense. And there's critical or emancipatory paradigm, which is more about transformation. And so it calls upon critical theories, participatory action research, Marxist, feminist, ethnic minority. In our case, it's not just ethnic minority, but there's we have gone through a period of oppression of ethnic majority and persons with disability. Emancipatory researchers argue that the constructivist interpretive researchers did change the rules, but did not change the nature of the game. That's the criticism that goes to especially post-colonial researchers. They did not do the complete work of transformation. They therefore confront politics in research and social oppression. Then there's anti-colonial, or what others like Bagele Chiliza call post-colonial paradigm. These challenge colonization of a body of knowledge that carries a hope and promotes a transformation and social change among the historically oppressed, because they keep this holistic relationships between human beings and environment, the cosmos, and living and the non-living, which speaks more to the indigenous people or communities. I personally prefer anti-colonial instead of post-colonial, because post-colonial as I have just said, is also criticized for having not done the complete work. Then, as I said, I have recently published an article titled Indigenizing Technological Pedagogical Content Knowledge in Open Distance Learning, which is it's a 2020 publication, which appears in Africa Education Review, where I vie for, I explain the fact that this paradigm, the oppressed are pushed by colonial forces to a point where they organize themselves into intellectual, academic, political, socio-economic, and physical forces of resistance. And I've used an example of the student unrest there. The stages of this paradigm are episodic warnings of resistance, resistance to the oppressed people's voices, action of resistance, then intervention. Now, coming to my last few slides, and specifically on ontology and epistemology, I've structured them in terms of, what the positivist standpoint of view say, and of interpretivist. First of all, ontology is about the knowledgeable and reality, how we perceive reality. And it's from also Greek origin, onto for being and logia for science, study or theory. And it's all about the structure, the nature and structure of the world. And I hope you will agree with me that our perception of the world differ. But you and I, when we engage in discourses, and I come, open to your views, your ideas, and you the same to mine, then we can actually enrich each other, and we can make the world a beautiful space to live, to realize that we view the world differently. Positivism keeps an objective stance, independent which is about independent reality, which is value-free, and it sees objectivity as truth towards knowledge generation. And it involves enumeration and use of statistics, which is seen as a device for emphasizing masculinity. As it was started, the history thereof was started mainly by the white male professors. It was started by the French philosopher by the name Auguste Comte, who was the founder of the paradigm itself, by studying social reality, and claimed that the social world can be studied same way as the natural world, which was later questioned by the interpretivists. Comte came up with the concept of fetichism, which is about irrationality, and he influenced the project of Edward Taylor, who also followed suit to suggest that there are primitive cultures, as he found in the 1800s, and in turn influenced the work of Levi-Brill, who came up with the concept of primitive mentality, and claimed further that primitive people are not governed by reason, and is quoted by Van der Waals saying, no real understanding is possible between primitive Africans and civilized Westerners. And primitive mind is basically irrational and logical according to this line of thinking. So that is why it is important for supervisors and students. As a student, when you shop around for a supervisor, to tease out the type of persons they are, how they might possibly influence your project, and things like that are quite essential. How do they view you, for an example? Are they going to come with a top-down kind of approach into your project and want to clone themselves in you as a researcher? This is quite critical for me. Reality is objective and measurable according to these people. Social processes, value-laden subjectivity as a lie. That's how they see it. Reality, that's why they will check you against the validity and reliability when they look at your study. Reality is independent of social construction according to them, whereas interpretivists or constructionists, and I put in brackets there, indigenization, they claim reality consists of people's subjective experiences. People of non-linearity, chaos and complexity theory applies in a social world. So you can't keep one stance or one lens towards reality. As they claim, there are many ways of seeing the world. Thus, although the course of study, perceptions may change, through the course of study, and perceptions may change as the study developed. Therefore, it is not always possible to establish research questions beforehand. And I'm not trying to say don't establish your research questions beforehand, but all that this statement is saying, there's a possibility, because you are going to treat your clients as core researchers in your project. Your research questions might be affected. You might have to come back and modify them or even change them based on what the fieldwork is giving you. Socially constructed reality is what they claim here, that knowledge is socially constructed, and therefore there's ownership by different people that actually negotiate what they make of the world, the ontology. Therefore, there's no correct or incorrect theories, as this is the theory developing. That's qualitative research. Knowledge and meaning are acts of interpretation, observation and interpretation, subjective experiences of individuals in context. And therefore, we've got to observe also the question of Ubuntu as a worldview, dominant worldview amongst indigenous people. You may want to refer to the article that I published last year with the late Dr. Carol, on Tatudi amongst the Bangladeshi, how they treat issues of Ubuntu by observing protocol, issues of respect, issues of unity, and community building. Therefore, knowledge, especially sacred knowledge amongst indigenous communities, is communally owned, and therefore it raises even issues of intellectual property rights. Then there is a relational aspect. Spirit beings and powers, spirit animals, impact thereof on science, which Western science refutes or doesn't accommodate, and therefore indigenous knowledge system suffers marginalization because you cannot separate it from spirituality. Spirituality is an underlying framework thereof. Then when we come to epistemology as the last point, then I will conclude. Truth and it's about truth and legitimate knowledge. And it addresses itself to fundamental questions, which you as a researcher will have to worry about. What is the relationship between the knower and what is known? These questions recur in a lot of indigenous literature. How do we know what we know? What counts as knowledge? And whose knowledge counts as such? With regard to epistemology, positivism keeps a deductive stance or logic that we've got to base our findings on what those that have researched before have said and their frameworks and idealism. And they test the knowledge through experimental studies, multivariate analysis, which involves stats to generalize the world, whereas interpretivists do not do that. And the treatment of research participants is that by the approach of treating the participants mostly as objects and knowledge givers and not as active participants in knowledge generation. And they would rely more on the validity and reliability of the knowledge gathered as opposed to the interpretivists who are more concerned about trustworthiness and credibility. They keep a distance between the inquirer and the inquired, whom they claim are independent of each other, and they believe that the goal of research is to derive universal laws, which they would want everyone to observe. Whereas interpretivists claim that the inquirer and the inquired person influence each other because they are equal participants in the research project and they must be respected. And they claim further that knowledge is fluid thereof as it is passed from generation to generation, but in a dynamic way as generations try to adapt to the environmental changes and conditions. They keep what is fundamental and change what needs to change or modify what needs to be modified. There are therefore perceptual experiences. I've quoted Paul Webb, who has conducted a case study in Eastern Cape, for an example, and then where teachers and learners felt strongly that IKS must be integrated in the science and technology curriculum, and came up with examples like the use of limestone to dye cloth, plowing techniques, the use of traditional medicine, and water divination. Knowledge from such experiences in context needs to be considered and bring transformation to curriculum. I have just authored an article with Dr. Haotobohwe from Botswana, and it will appear in the Journal for Management, Spirituality and Religion, where we are reflecting on the denial of the the indigenous practitioners in as far as finding solutions towards fighting COVID-19. And the questions, issues of steaming, for an example, which have long been a practice among indigenous communities. Then there's practical application of the inner space discovery, where people actually get into themselves and try to make sense of the reality as they treat themselves as part of the greater ecosystem. And as elders practitioners, educational roles. And for this, I have quoted this example, which I once quoted in my PhD study, a research that was conducted in northwestern Uganda, where a group of learners in a school, remembering that a particular tribe held the monopoly of iron smelting, made contact with the elders of the tribe and persuaded them to pass on to them their technological secret. A furnace was built at the school by one group of learners under the guidance of the elders, while another group looked into the supply of raw materials, discovering as they did so a highly complex pattern of trading in ore and finished iron goods. Not only was iron produced successfully at the school, but what had started as a simple example finished up with the learners appreciating the role of the smiths in the cultural milieu of the tribe. The learners who at first hand been inclined to look down on the tribal elders came to realize how skilled they were in many ways and how rich their own cultural environment was. This puts a stance towards education, which mostly tends to make learners look down on their own elders because they are seen as primitive and not rich or with knowledge. So transformation has got to bring this respect back by even valuing the knowledge that elders have as custodians of indigenous knowledge, or living libraries for that matter. In conclusion, I have this advice to give to especially supervisors and students in a research project. Start by being interested in the students' worldview, how this could inform their paradigm. This should be part of the initial discussions at your introduction of each other once the students have registered. Encourage anti-colonial paradigm in students' research work, and observe social construction of knowledge. Don't make yourself superior per se. Yes, you are an academic elder by way of having gone first and being a knowledge expert in your field, but that does not preclude the fact that you need to respect what the student is bringing to the table as a scholar who is reading literature and trying to make sense of what they are reading. And you need not to close them down, but listen to what they are saying, making sense of what they are reading. Consider encouraging mixed methods, multi-methods, participatory action research methods. They have a lot of variety, including self-action research, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary case studies, especially case studies because indigenous people like telling stories, and push the students to make sense of their literature and theories from their own context. Encourage consultation of literature by African indigenous scholars. There is this traditional approach to believe that Western scholars are reputable scholars and indigenous scholars not. If we are to bring transformation, true transformation, we've got to encourage students to pull in indigenous scholars. In a book that has been published that some referred to in my introduction, I, as the editor of the book, I put a restriction to the contributors of chapters to say I needed to see 70% of the literature that they consult being by indigenous scholars. Not that other scholars have not actually would not be important to consider. But if we are to bring true transformation, like I said, we need to promote indigenous scholars as well. Then there's a need to actually engage in a type of scholars, research that would, promote elders as well, to tap on the knowledge that elders actually have. So for certain studies that suggest that your target participants must include elders, we should not even waste time to pull them in. Chairperson, this is my story for the day.